Hello everyone, really glad that you could come back again, and I'll be telling you the next exciting story about Edward Beetroot. So if you get yourself comfortable, and then I'll begin. Right, if you're ready. This is the story of Edward Beetroot and survival of the fattest. Freedom at last. Henry was no longer grounded. Last week, his large ginger cat, Edward Beetroot, had gotten him into an enormous amount of trouble. Edward had been instrumental in the new school shoes muddy puddles scandal. Edward Beetroot, as we know, was no ordinary cat. He could talk. Only to Henry, but he could talk all right. As his mother would say, he could talk the hind legs off a donkey. Edward's talking had always seemed to land Henry in a spot of bother. Edward was what his father called a maverick. He had to look that word up. It meant someone who didn't follow the crowd, someone who acted on their own instincts. Well, yes, Edward Beetroot could certainly be described as that. Edward Beetroot was sat on the end of Henry's bed. It looked from the view out of his bedroom window to be a beautifully warm spring day, and as it was still the Easter holidays, Henry and Edward still had plenty of opportunity to spend time together.
"Oh, I say, Henry, what shall we do today? We really should do something special now you've finally been given parole."
Henry could see that Edward was already scheming up an idea, and to be honest, it unnerved him somewhat. "What did you have in mind, Edward?" Edward smiled, if indeed cats could. This one certainly did, which only added to Henry's concern.
"Oh, well, I was thinking maybe an exercise in survival."
Henry scratched his head. "Well, as nice as that sounds, Edward Beetroot, we always seem to find trouble when we go on one of your adventures. Maybe we should stay at home, watch a bit of telly, have a game of football, and, chill out a bit."
"Oh, nonsense," said Edward. "Let's seize the day. It could be raining tomorrow, and I might be keen on puddles, but I am certainly not a fan of drizzle. It ruins my fur."
He licked his paws and smoothed a stray ginger hair into place.
"Oh, I've an excellent idea. Let's go on an expedition to the woods. Make a base camp."
Henry pondered how and when exactly Edward had been in the army, as he was adopted as a kitten by Henry and his family from the farm at the top of the lane. Any questioning, and Edward would always respond with,
"Why, Henry, can't you let me have my moment to shine?"
Edward was really rather theatrical, as if the ability to talk was not enough of a moment to shine. Henry had to admit that this did sound exciting. What could go wrong? He would certainly not make the same mistake as last time, and he would avoid all puddles, however shallow. Anyway, he suspected that they would have all dried up by now. "OK, Edward, but let's avoid any mischief, eh?"
"Oh, no, there'll be no trouble. Don't be in any doubt, Henry, that you may well struggle. I've had years of training. I am used to physical exertion, surviving with minimum rations. Best fetch a rucksack, Henry, and we will fill it with basic provisions. Let the adventures begin."
Edward barked out the orders, if cats could bark, of what he considered they would need, and Henry packed everything into the rucksack. It seemed that cream was an essential, not of the suntan variety, although Henry argued that it would possibly go sour in the heat, and had very much doubted that this had been a staple during the war, as Edward would rather have him believe. Despite Edward insisting they would be required to forage for their own food, he did, however, allow for 2 rounds of tuna sandwiches, some crisps, and a bottle of lemonade. They also packed an old sheet to act as a shelter, some binoculars, and Henry's Nerf gun in case of crossing enemy lines, of course. Edward insisted that Henry wore khaki as camouflage, and when Henry questioned how a large, round, luminous orange Edward would stay undetected, he was met with a,
"Oh, don't worry about me, dear boy. I can make myself undetectable to the human eye."
So off Henry and Edward set down the long winding lane that left Pear Tree Cottage towards the woodland. They set off at a brisk march, singing heartily to keep the morale up. It wasn't more than 10 minutes before Edward Beetroot's short little legs and stout body began to tire.
We will head to the clearing in the woods, Henry, and make camp. I think we need to draw upon our provisions. We need to keep our strength in case we meet the enemy.
Henry wondered just who that enemy might be. The clearing was just over a little bridge that crossed a stream. Henry had often visited here in his younger years with his mother. They would throw a stick into the water to see whose stick would pass under the bridge first. What had the game been called? Ah, yes, poo sticks. It occurred to him that Edward might like to have a go. "Fancy a game of poo sticks, Edward?" Henry had asked. Edward seemed to ponder this for a moment before replying,
"So sorry, old chum, but I went this morning. Regular as clockwork, I am."
Henry considered it best not to ask questions and let the moment pass.
"OK, let's set up. Henry, we will need some string, some sturdy branches, and that old bedsheet we packed."
Edward Beetroot had planted himself firmly on an old tree stump, suggesting that he was not going to be doing an awful lot of the camp erecting himself, preferring to sit in the shade and direct Henry. There's only one problem, Beetroot," Henry announced. "You didn't mention packing any string." Edward rolled his eyes. If indeed cats can roll their eyes, this one could.
"Oh, never mind. We'll have to make do."
After 20 minutes of propping a bedsheet over 3 loosely balanced branches, Henry had assembled what could vaguely be described as a tent. Very vaguely. Edward got up to survey Henry's work, his tail held loftily and a pained expression on his furry face.
"I suppose it will do. I, of course, could have done a much better job."
Henry wondered why he hadn't, but thought better of mentioning this.
"I will try it out for size."
No sooner had Edward entered the makeshift shelter than the whole thing collapsed on him. There was an awful lot of cursing and failed attempts of distangling himself from the bedsheet, until Henry managed to free a very disgruntled Edward.
"Oh, that won't do. That won't do at all. I guess we'll just have to brave the outside."
"Or," said Henry, "we could just go home to our beds." Edward Beetroot pondered on this, but not for too long.
"Oh, not up to it, Henry. Too hard for you, this surviving in the wild. I understand. Not everyone can face the challenge. I guess we ought to head back. I would never dream of leaving a comrade. It is my duty to see you back safely."
And this, dear reader, is what they did after devouring 2 rounds of sandwiches, crisps and pop, and spending a lazy afternoon skimming stones in the stream. They headed back just as the last of the sun was about to fade. They had gone no more than 20 minutes when Edward stopped abruptly. "Dear, sweet Henry, I don't know if I can go any more, dear fellow. I am wasting away. The physical exertion and lack of food and water has taken its toll. I don't think I'm going to make it." Edward slumped to the floor, his paw to his head in a theatrical manner. "Well, you could do that, Edward, or I could just pick you up."
Oh, no. You must save yourself, dear, dear boy. My time has come. I've done my bit for king and country. Remember me, Henry,"
Edward dramatically announced. "Oh, all right then, Edward Beetroot. I shall have to leave you here then." Edward looked stricken and somewhat panicked.
"Oh, if you insist, then you'll need to get me through the enemy lines."
With that, Edward raised two large padded feet up onto Henry and allowed himself to be hauled up and nestled against his brother in arms. Edward was a lump of a cat, and it was no easy task carrying him. Henry did consider putting Edward in his rucksack, but Edward would have found that most undignified. They hadn't gone more than a few feet when Edward whispered urgently,
"Get down, man. We are approaching the enemy."
Henry crouched behind the head and peered to his left. So this was the enemy, old Mr. Whittaker of number 35. He was busy innocently working on his vegetable patch, looking every bit as menacing as next door's tortoise. "Really, Edward, Mr. Whittaker is the enemy, but he seems really old and doesn't seem particularly menacing," Henry declared.
"Oh, don't be deceived, Henry. I fertilised his garden once as a neighbourly gesture, and he nearly took me out with a well-aimed slipper. Absolutely dreadful behaviour. And the language, Henry! Called me a rogue and a scoundrel, no less. I think we ought to lie low, hide out for a bit, suss out the enemy, be prepared to take action. If we get caught, our lives could be at stake, Henry."
Henry watched as Mr. Whittaker rubbed at the arch of his back and took off his cap and scratched the top of his snowy white head. He looked tired and frail as he lowered himself onto the garden bench. A cup of what Henry assumed to be tea was perched next to him, and a packet of biscuits.
"Henry," Edward whispered in a panicked voice, "the old codger has our biscuits."
"I don't think there are biscuits, Henry. Probably just the same brand."
No, they are the same ones. I know, because they were on the kitchen sideboard, and I tried to get into them and left a very distinctive scratch mark at the top of the packet."
Quite how Edward could see scratches on a packet of biscuits 20 foot away was anyone's guess.
"The blighter! He must have slipped into the house during the night and stolen them. He knows full well that an army marches on its stomach,"
quite literally in Edward's case.
"and he took them so he can form an attack, knowing that we will be near starvation and ready to surrender. We must get them back."
Henry did not think this was a good idea and told Edward Beetroot as much.
"Look, it will be easy. The old chap's guard is down. 10 minutes and he'll be snoozing. I've seen this happen before. You keep watch, and I will sneak behind enemy lines and retrieve the biscuits. We'll be in and out in 10 minutes. Guard me with your gun."
I'm afraid we're going to leave it on a cliffhanger tonight. So please come back next Wednesday to find out what happens to Edward and Henry. I would love to see some photos of your pets, and if you don't have any, maybe you could draw a picture of an imaginary pet. Also, it would be fantastic if you could draw some illustrations to go with the stories of Edward Beetroot and share them on here for all of us to see. Now, before I go, I want you to remember that you are safe and loved. Air hugs and lots of kisses. Good night, everyone. Sleep tight.